Thanks. It's like going down memory lane here. Before I'm assigned Chapter 4, and I'll talk about Chapter 4. But before I do so, I'm going to put my quasi-space hat on for a minute, because in my job in the Pentagon, I also looked at the space industrial base and have been involved over the years. And I remember in the late 90s in the Pentagon, the strategy when they set up the EELV program. That's the large medium lift for space. And the strategy at the time was we can afford two, and we can afford two because there's going to be this great commercial demand for lift. But what happened? The commercial Iridium tanked the commercial demand for space in the United States in terms of launch needs, cratered. NASA's gone out of the shuttle business for a period of years, and the reality is today the problem that commission report pointed out about launch costs back then is even worse today. And we have in the United States today, essentially most of the launch industry is DoD. That's the reality of it. Most of the commercial lift launch has gone offshore. Keeping costs down in that context is extraordinarily difficult, because you have, essentially the people making launch vehicles and engines for launch vehicles are putting all their overhead on a small set of vehicles today, and they're all defense. And so it creates an enormous challenge for the future, and it's amplified by the fact that, I want to say this carefully, I don't believe we have had a competitive procurement for a new large or medium engine for launch in the United States in 30 to 40 years. All right? Think about that. The engines on our launch vehicles today, the ELV, are either Russian derivative, or really Russian, or they're 1960s technology. The problem is the cost of this is so high that even NASA, when it did the recent, it's given $1 billion to one of the vendors to develop a new engine for, I think, the Mars program. It's to upgrade one of the old engines. And so I don't have the solution, but I think certainly it's going to have to be rely on commercial vehicles much more than the past. And we all hope that the SpaceX launch to the space station takes off, because I think those kinds of solutions, commercial solutions, and not DoD orphan programs, are probably realistically going to be the future of launch for the near term. Let me switch hats now. That's just an aside. When I look at the defense world here, and let me say I've been in a number of these studies. This is not the only study on defense and aerospace industry. This is certainly a leading one. Hopefully over time, the force and effect of the cumulative weight of these studies does tend to migrate into policy to some extent, and I think this one is like that, is the way I would put it. But you ask me the impact of this and other studies like it. When I look at the era in which this was written, 2002, Leslie alluded to it, we were at the end of the low-budget era in defense. We'd had September 11th, Afghanistan war was going on, Iraq had not yet happened, and the report in some ways was responding to an earlier period of time when, in the late 90s, when I was in office, the defense industry was viewed as fragile and vulnerable. And we ratcheted down from 70 to 5 suppliers, and the question was, do we have robust defense industrial capabilities sufficient to meet our needs going forward? At the time, the Commission was worried about instability of demand, and so we were at the end of an era of austerity, really, here, and beginning a ramp-up. And they were worried about the instability of demand and concern over the level of our R&D, aging of the workforce, maintaining our industrial infrastructure in some sectors marked by low demand, solid rocket boosters, government-imposed barriers on our industry, including export controls. Sound familiar? Because these same issues really are back today. What we've had is an interim period. At the time, the recommendations they issued were, let's have a defense industrial base policy that's coherent. We take the industrial base into account when we do shape our budgets and our procurements and our force structure. Let's do acquisition reform and have policies that include techniques like prototyping that allow continuous exercise of design and production skills over time, stable funding for core capabilities, which will better attract the best and the brightest and help to address the graying of the workforce, removing barriers to international sales, which relates to the point mentioned at the beginning of really adjusting to a globalizing world, and sustaining key technology is not likely to be sustained like rocket motors. I don't mean to pick on rocket motors, but this was in the report, and so I think it's just illustrative more than anything else. Needless to say, the world changed. We went from an era of austerity really to a rich man's world in defense. And so it really shelved a lot of these issues because you don't have to worry too much about stable funding when the budget went, from $345 billion in, including the operations in 2002, to about $700 billion in 2010. Spending was robust, it was high, there were a target-rich opportunity for companies, and that cures a lot of ills about the fragility of the defense industrial base that people focused on at the end of the 90s. Indeed, what you had was, for a period of years, really the biggest bull market in defense history, where barriers fell because the Pentagon said, we need something for this operation. You bring it, you test it, and if it works, we're going to buy it. People got orders over the transom. It was a remarkable period in defense history. What really happened was, in defense, you have really two procurement systems. You have the big one, which everybody always focuses on, which is very hard, and which, long-term solutions, very expensive, the next new generation satellite system, the Joint Strike Fighter. What happened in this era, you also always had a little defense procurement system, and that's driven by operational needs, where instead of starting with a requirement 20 years ago that leads to generating a program and it takes forever, somebody in the field said, we have an ID threat, I need something to address this now. All right, and that little program, that little defense procurement system really became a much more important thing, and billions of dollars were spent on up-armoring our vehicles, on armoring, body armor and protective suits, on all sorts of things, on the war against terrorism that were imperative operational needs today. And in that world, foreign companies, US commercial companies, people who had a solution got to play. It's been a remarkable period in a lot of ways. Well, now we've come full circle because here we are again. The wars are winding down. Iraq is finished. Afghanistan is slowing down. Our operational level abroad is slowing down. The challenges are still high, to be sure. But now we are back to an era of austerity driven by the economy, driven by the need to reprioritize, if you will. And so we're back to the same issues, really, that the Commission raised. On the budgets and the numbers, I'll just give you one vignette. I remember being in the Pentagon in the late 90s when we had a meeting in circa 99 or 2000 where the budget was $240 billion, and it was going up. And Bill Lynn, who was then the Comptroller General, who later became Deputy Secretary in the Obama administration, made a big presentation to the senior leadership on the 2001 budget, or 2000 budget. It was going to be $300 billion for the first time in 7 years, and everybody applauded, all right? So what are we talking about now? We're talking about a ratcheting down, from, $700 billion, including operations, to, what's the worst case here? A budget somewhere in the high fours, low fives, and maybe 50 in operational expending. My view of it is, and I know not everybody agrees with that I think we could do what we need to do on, $200 billion more than the 300 we tried to do it with in 2000.